Hey, dear friends, I'm coming to you here tonight from our YWAM Cafe, The Bridge, at our YWAM base in Arvada, a suburb of Denver. I just came back from an afternoon with our grandkids and kids having Shabbat, and then having fellowship. We went swimming and jotted a bunch of things down on 2 pieces of paper here. I want to share from my heart with you. I believe God is brokenhearted over some of the things we're encountering in our nation. I want to speak, although I'm Australian by birth, I'm a dual citizen now. I've lived in this nation for 40 years. I want to speak to us as Americans in particular. And so let me read you what I posted online on my Facebook page a couple of days ago. There's a powerful principle found in the Word of God that tells us to take personal responsibility not only for our own transgressions, but also for the transgressions of others, specifically our people, the ones with whom I'm identified, my people group. It doesn't mean they're exonerated from their transgressions, but by me identifying, even with their sin, it does something very powerful and very significant in the spiritual realm. Think of it as an ambassador going from a nation representing the president or prime minister and the authorities in their nation and saying, we'd like to have access into your nation or this particular area of business. I'm representing my nation. I'd like to serve you. We'd like to serve you. We would like to ask forgiveness for this thing that took place. That's a very powerful thing, and many have done that toward different people groups around the world. The indigenous people of Australia and in North America as well. We've seen some of these things take place. It's very significant. And then I went on, with this in mind, I want to ask my non-white friends to please forgive us for the endemic racism, discrimination, and white privilege many of us, and here's a big part of the problem, many of us are oblivious to. It's not okay, and you have a right to be angry. Anger is not intrinsically wrong. That's why the New Testament tells us to be angry and not sin. So you can be angry and not sin. When you have a kind of a holy discontent about something, and I know many of you feel that. I feel that holy discontent. And I think many people feel angry about a number of things, the violence and the insensitivity, and but more than anything else, I think just the indifference. We can't be silent at a time like this. And so, where do we find this in the scriptures, that we can actually confess our own sin, but also the sins of other people? And one of the examples of this is Nehemiah. Nehemiah confessed his own sin, Nehemiah 1 verse 6, and the sins of the Israelites. So he confessed the sins of his people group and his own sin and the sins of his father's family or his ancestors as well. Daniel did a similar thing. In Daniel 9:20, it says that he confessed his sin and the sins of the people, or of my people. We see that God spoke to Moses and told him, if they will confess their sin, talking about the children of Israel in Leviticus 26 verse 40, if they'll confess their sin and the sins of their ancestors. And then he goes on to say in verse 42, I will remember my covenant. So there was a need to express, to confess, to make right something on their personal behalf, but also on behalf of those with whom they were associated. someone asked me after they read my post, well, what are you confessing in particular? And I thought about that, and I think that what the Lord was convicting me about was a level of indifference. I had underestimated the level of pain, especially that many of my brothers and sisters of color were experiencing. And it all came to light, and I'm sure many of you, this might have been shocking that this came out and is coming out in such a strong way, because the wound is very deep that they've been living with. Just think of this: if I do this, if I hit my arm, well, that doesn't really hurt me. But just imagine I had cut myself about a week ago and had 10 stitches in my arm. If I was to do that, boy, it would be excruciating. And I think for me personally, I knew there were problems, and I haven't been oblivious to those problems entirely, but I underestimated the degree of the pain that I've seen in many of my friends of color. So, indifference in the Bible is a sin. Not long after I posted that, I posted another blurb on Facebook yesterday at 3 p.m. In the Bible, indifference toward the needs of others is considered a sin. Because someone said, well, tell me where we can find indifference in the Bible as being sinful. There are many passages, but I'll mention one in the New Testament. Jesus would teach mainly through parables or telling stories. In fact, the Bible is full of stories. 83% of the Bible is narrative. Only 17% conceptual. Most of it is narrative, 83%. It's about 400 stories, give or take a few. And this was Jesus' main way of communicating. In fact, there's one verse that says Jesus didn't teach people except by parables. And some of these parables, I would say all of them are really powerful, but some of them are extremely powerful. And one of them in particular is the story, you know it, it's the story of the Good Samaritan. What was significant about this story was the contrast between this man who helped the one who was by the side of the road, who'd been robbed and injured, compared to two supposed spiritual leaders. A priest who came and he walked by and tried to ignore what he had seen. And then a Levite who did pretty much the same thing. What was it that they did? Well, they were indifferent toward this man's needs. We need to be like this Good Samaritan, that we reach out to others, that we're not oblivious, we're not indifferent to the things they're going through. If I was to ask you, what is this sin, or what was the sin of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? Most people would say, well, it was sexual perversion of different kinds. That was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? We all know that. Well, no, that actually wasn't the root sin. There was a root sin that then gave way to all these other sins and falling away from God. And we find it in Ezekiel 16:49. And in Ezekiel 16:49, he says, bear with me here. Now, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant and overfed and unconcerned, and they didn't help the poor and the needy. Wow, they were indifferent. They had affluence, they were proud, they were overfed. boy, is there anything that better describes where we're at as a culture? And they were unconcerned for the needs of the poor and other people who were in need. They were indifferent. And this is a great sin before God. And I think for us in the church, we have to do something about it. And things need to change, mainly in our attitude more than in laws and regulations. Because many times laws don't actually change things. For example, close to 200 years, there were Jim Crow laws. For those that are not Americans, these laws were in place that mandated racial segregation in all public areas in the United States, similar to apartheid in South Africa. And these existed in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And it wasn't really until probably the 1960s and the burning of urban ghettos and that many people began to realize there was a problem. But back up, about 160 years ago, the President of the United States at the time, Abraham Lincoln, signed an executive order that changed the legal status of approximately 3.5 million African Americans. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, that took place 160 years ago, where everything changed in terms of slavery in the United States. Isn't that amazing? It changed 160 years ago. Well, it didn't. It changed legally, but in practice it didn't change because people's hearts still were prejudiced, and there was racism and discrimination and white privilege. Many of the things we see today. I remember going to LA right after the Rodney King situation where he was killed, and that happened about 2 miles from the YWAM base where my wife and I met and used to work. And just the riots and then it died down, but now we're seeing it again, probably in a much greater way. And it's not a time for us to teach or to state what we think is right. It's a time right now to remove the offense. That's what we need to do. We need to remove the offense. And part of the offense is a huge indifference toward the needs of people of color in this nation. And it's not okay. It's not okay to God either. So what can we do? What are we supposed to do? Well, we've got to do something. We've got to either do something or speak out. The other day, our YWAM base went downtown Denver and we cleaned up. There was graffiti everywhere and picked up trash. And I can't even begin to tell you how therapeutic that was for us. My son-in-law, one of my sons-in-law, and two of my grandkids went along and we picked up trash, and it was very significant, the fact that we were doing something. It was just really a small thing. There's also, and I can't underscore this enough, there are spiritual forces of evil around us. In the scriptures, the point is very clear that we're not really wrestling against flesh and blood primarily. And these evil forces are empowered by people's evil acts. And how do we deal with that? Well, many times our identifying with the people and what they're going through and confessing it. There's a power in confession that actually breaks the power of the enemy over cities and nations. This was made really clear to me years ago. I was on a YWAM outreach, and we were in Argentina, and we were in a city called Cordoba, and there were 300 of us in Cordoba, Argentina. We'd come from all over the world, We actually were in 5 different cities, and 300 of us were gathered in Cordoba to share the gospel. But people were not interested. It was like trying to plow on fallow ground. It was so hard. And as our leaders went to prayer, they felt that the ruling principality over the city of Cordoba was pride. And this is how the Lord led them. And I'd never seen this done before, but I tell you what, it was powerful. The contrast was like night and day. The next day, all 300 of us went into downtown Cordoba on street corners in the main plaza, and we got on our knees and we confessed our own sin of pride, and then we confessed the sin of pride over the Argentinian people and over the city of Cordoba. We didn't see something, at least that we could see at that specific moment that took place, but the next day when we came out to do outreach, it was unbelievable. I mean, hundreds of people were stopping and we were sharing the gospel and people were coming to Christ. And it was a stark difference simply because we confessed our sin and the prevailing sins of the people in that area. Doing something is significant. Words or actions. Our words and actions have spiritual implications, right? I mean, think about it. When I came to Christ, I was baptized. But what was it about baptism? Because there was nothing special about the water. But as I symbolically died and rose again as Jesus did, there was something that took place in the spiritual realm when I was baptized. When I take the Lord's Supper, when I take communion and remember his death on the cross and his resurrection, something happens by eating those elements. It's the physical act. You understand this? It's significant. In fact, you can't even be saved simply by faith. It's by believing in your heart and confessing with your lips that Jesus Christ is Lord. It is the physical act that establishes that. And there's something about physically getting involved. And I want to encourage you, maybe God would convict you of indifference like he did me. But maybe it's something else. But you need to do something. Even me sharing with you and posting these things on Facebook was powerful. It's done something in my spirit. But we can't remain silent at this time. Our silence, especially as followers of Jesus, our silence is deafening to those who are hurting. It's shouting at them. And so I want to close with this passage. I'm sure you've read it before, and it's in the book of Esther. And Esther had come to the kingdom. She was the queen. But there was an evil man who was seeking to destroy her people. And her uncle, Mordecai, came to her and he said, Esther, because she didn't want to go into the king, because if she went in and he didn't extend his scepter to her, she'd be killed automatically. And so she was afraid. And he said this. He said, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And so, I want to encourage all of us, me included, that we cannot remain silent. And we can't be indifferent. We have to speak up on behalf of others. We have to not avoid, but run to them, and like the Good Samaritan, that we would minister to those who are in need. It's not that they're in need necessarily for us to give physical means to them, but to stand with them, to love them, to support them, to stand alongside of them, because they are our brothers and sisters in the human race. And so that's the word I felt I wanted to share tonight from my heart, and I pray that you would receive it. It's Friday, and so we have a weekend. We'll be back next week. YWAM Denver Live, Monday through Friday. Bless you, and tune in again soon, okay?